ladies and gentlemen, this is a museum as we all know it, as you probably know it, classical museum. This is as well, White Cube. But I personally wish that museums would look slightly different, that they might look a little bit like this, or maybe even like this. And why is that? Let's recap. A museum was erected in the 19th century as a principle. And it was supposed to be didactic, supposed to be educational, which means that the underlying principle was a sort of artistic apartheid. You all know apartheid, right? Fortunately abolished in South Africa, but still de rigueur in museums. If you look at this, then you'll see it, you'll feel it. It's not about the whiteness, it's about the separation. You put art objects in splendid isolation. Art objects from different periods are not mixed, they're kept apart. They're kept pure, unadulterated. And that's clear, it's obvious, it's very understandable, but it's not very exciting. As you know, some of you like to drink beer, some of you like to drink wine, but cocktails are a lot more exciting. Cocktails are more fizz, and this is a cocktail. Mixing old and contemporary art creates bubble, it creates fizz, it creates an additional meaning, it creates polyphony, an infinity of possible meanings. And I wish that museums would do that more often, not be afraid to mix, to use what the French call métissage, carambolage, or what Salman Rushdie simply called bastardization. Bastards are usually negative, or it's a negative connotation, but bastardization is fun. It means mixing things that don't belong together and make it into something entirely different. Fusion is a more simple term. We all know fusion kitchen. This is a fusion museum. And why would we want to do that? I just said it creates additional meaning, but it does a lot more. It's you could do this as well, if you really want Jeff Koons. Why would we do that? It's because a museum usually thinks like an art historian. An art historian classifies, makes clear linear lines, but museums should also think like artists, like this artist, Mark Leckey. Artists are not inhibited by boundaries in time, in cultures, in geography. They cross everything. They mix Buddhist sculpture with blobs, with shoes, with Mesopotamic sculpture. It doesn't matter. Artists are not afraid to go across time, to be transhistorical. A second reason for the Fusion Museum is the Cabinet of Curiosities. Before we had museums in the 19th century, you had cabinets of curiosity. Private collectors who didn't just collect painting, as you see, but also shells, stuffed animals, coral, anything, you name it, ostrich eggs, and they mixed that freely. Everything that was exotic and an object of wonder belonged together. It didn't need to be separate. It could be joined, it could be mixed. A third reason to fuse stuff in the museum is that is how we live. This might not be your living room, it's not mine either, but it's a beautiful example of total eclecticism, an extreme one. But maybe if you think of your own living room, you might have IKEA furniture mixed with design. You might have a little antique cabinet from grandma mixed with new carpets. You might have some kitsch on the wall combined with high art. We live in environments that are not pure, that are not clean. Most of our environments, although some of you might be modernist purists, are fun, celebratory, frivolous, like this living room, although it might make it slightly uneasy to read a book there. Another reason to fuse in museums that simply is that art is not logical. Art is not a sort of Cartesian logic system. It's not mathematics, it's not algebra. It very often creates meaning through confusion. So if we put a museum that fuses, it actually mimics the logic of art. And how do we do that? How can you do that? This is a very simple example from my own museum. You see Rineke Dijkstra, 21st century photographer, with Salomon de Braai, 17th century painter. And what happens if you put these two together? There's one thing that happens, means that artists talk to each other across the divide of centuries. There's actually a conversation going on here between somebody who has been dead for more than 300 years and somebody who lives today. Somebody who uses a new medium like photography and somebody who uses a very old medium like oil painting. And for you as a viewer, maybe not in this reproduction, but in real life, it makes you look instead of seeing. It makes you focus. You look at similarities, you look at differences, you look at the pose, you look at how these ladies represent themselves. And you might also be encouraged to think that there's continuity in art, like in life. Art from the 17th century looks very different from art today, but there's the same kind of leitmotifs in it. There's a similar idea, similar feelings, similar motivations to make art are still at hand. And if you put those two literally together, that might kind of resonate with you as an audience. And a third reason that I find very important is if you put those two together, it creates another kind of emotional value. If you look at these two ladies, you might suddenly sense that they belong together, that they might be family, that they resemble each other. They might be sisters, mother and daughter, mother and grandmother. There's a very illogical thing happening. These people cannot be family. They're centuries apart. But if you put them in a room, you suddenly have this sentiment, a sense of belonging. And this combination provokes you not to just think about art, but to feel it. And maybe that's one of the main reasons to combine old masters with contemporary art. It's about feeling. We all know that museums show art. They preserve art. They conserve art. They study it. They produce meaning, they show art, but in my opinion, and I'm not alone, they should also provoke curiosity and wonder and amazement and sometimes bewilderment. And there's this funny thing about us human beings. Most of the time we become curious when we don't understand something. We can become curious when we don't know something. It's a kind of positive negative. If you know everything, you're not curious. If you're puzzled and bewildered, you're curious to know more. And I believe that an unusual cocktail of old masters and contemporary art is not always easy or self-evident, but it will hopefully tickle your imagination. And it will make you understand that art should not just be felt, but understood as well, that it should not be observed by your heart only, but also by your head, and vice versa. That you need to experience art with every possible sense you have in your body and in your brain. And I just want to ask you to keep that in mind when you next walk into a museum. Maybe the Frans Hals Museum, a museum, any other museum in the world that loves to mix tradition and tomorrow, that loves to mix art from now with art from yesterday. Just keep in mind that you're not supposed to get it. You're not supposed to understand. You're supposed to think like an artist. You're supposed to blur, cross boundaries, think diversity, just violate every border and that you know, and just follow one lead. I realize that my final quote might be, most people in the room might be too young or too old to know this song En Vogue, but they simply say, free your mind and the rest will follow. Thank you.